Whether you see him as a savior, a prophet, or just an influential historical figure, there's one thing you really can't deny. The life of Jesus of Nazareth absolutely changed the world. So in this explainer, we're going to dive into the historical and religious accounts to get a better handle on the man behind this massive movement and the teachings that are still making waves 2,000 years later.
And when I say massive, I mean it. The scale of his influence is just staggering. We're talking billions of lives over the course of 2 millennia. But it goes way beyond just religion. Even if you're not a believer yourself, his story has shaped fundamental parts of our modern world. I mean, everything from the year on your calendar to the big ethical questions we're still debating today. So that brings us to the big question we're going to tackle. How did this happen? How did one itinerant preacher from a pretty small town in Galilee end up becoming the central figure of the world's largest religion and a major prophet in another one? It's an incredible story. To really get to the bottom of it, we're going to follow his story in 5 key parts. We'll kick things off with what historians generally agree on, then we'll trace his journey from his small town roots to becoming a public figure. After that, we'll unpack his core message, and finally, we'll explore how his death became the unlikely catalyst for a global legacy that endures to this day.
Okay, so where do we even begin? Well, first things first, let's establish what a broad scholarly consensus actually agrees on. We're going to try to separate the historical man from all the layers of theology and legend that have been built up over the centuries. So while tons of details about his life are up for debate, historians, and we're talking both Christian and non-Christian scholars here, overwhelmingly agree that Jesus was a real person, a Jewish teacher from Galilee. And crucially, there are 2 events that are considered historical bedrock: his baptism by John the Baptist and his crucifixion by the Romans. You can think of those 2 facts as the bookends for his entire public life. Okay, so let's rewind and go back to the beginning. Before he was this major public figure, Jesus was a man living in a specific time and a specific place. And understanding that context is absolutely key to understanding the rest of his story. This timeline gives us the basic framework of his life. He was born under Roman rule, grew up in the little town of Nazareth. But what's really striking is just how brief his public life was. His entire ministry, from his baptism when he was about 30 to his crucifixion, lasted maybe only a few years. All of this world-changing impact happened in an incredibly short span of time. Just think about that. The Gospels also tell us he had a specific trade. He's called a tekton, which is a Greek word that means carpenter, or maybe more broadly a craftsman, like a stoneworker or a builder. And this detail is so important because it tells us about his social status. He wasn't a priest or some member of the elite. He was a working man from a pretty ordinary town. So after his baptism, Jesus kicks off this intense period of public ministry that will completely define his legacy. He becomes an itinerant teacher, just traveling from village to village. So what did he actually do during these few years that had such a massive lasting impact? Well, his ministry really revolved around 3 key activities. First, he built a movement. He gathered this core group of 12 apostles who went everywhere with him. Second, he taught, using this revolutionary method, parables. Instead of getting bogged down in dense theology, he used simple, memorable stories that anyone could relate to explain these huge ideas. And third, the Gospels tell us he performed miracles, which, for the people who saw them, were powerful signs of divine authority. Now, it's really important to remember that our main sources for his life, the 4 Gospels, aren't like modern biographies. They're more like theological portraits, and each one has a different focus. The first 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are often called the Synoptic Gospels because they tell a pretty similar story, one where Jesus often keeps his identity as the Messiah a secret. But then you have the Gospel of John, which was written later, and it presents a Jesus who is openly and boldly proclaiming his divinity right from the get-go. So, okay, we've talked about what he did, but what was the central message that drew in so many followers? What were these ethical teachings that have continued to resonate for 2 whole millennia? This quote right here gets straight to the heart of it. When somebody asked him to just summarize the entire Jewish law, Jesus boiled it all down to these 2 commands. This intense focus on love for God and love for other people, was the absolute foundation of everything he taught. And his teachings really pushed beyond just following religious rules. He was calling for a radical kind of personal ethic. I mean, just think about it. Love your enemies. Forgive the people who hurt you. Prioritize the poor and the outcasts. In the world of the Roman Empire, this call for non-retaliation and radical compassion was completely revolutionary. And honestly, it's still profoundly challenging for us today.
All right, now we come to the final days of his life, and this is where we find a huge paradox. It was his death and what his followers believed happened right after that would launch this small Jewish movement into a global faith.
It's pretty incredible. The Gospels devote about a third of their entire text to this one single week in Jerusalem. It was just this period of intense conflict, starting with his provocative entry into the city and then his disruption at the temple. These actions put him on a direct collision course with both the Jewish religious authorities and the Roman occupiers, and it all culminated in his arrest, his trial, and his execution by crucifixion, which was a Roman punishment reserved for rebels and insurrectionists.
So the belief that he was resurrected after his death is what lit the fuse for Christianity. But his legacy is so much bigger than just a single faith. In Islam, he's revered as Isa, a mighty prophet of God. In Judaism, he's a historical figure, but not the Messiah. And even from a purely secular historical viewpoint, he's recognized as the Jewish preacher whose followers started one of the most significant movements in all of human history. He's a figure who belongs not just to one story, but to many.
And that leaves us with this final question to chew on. The story of Jesus isn't just about ancient history. It's a living force that continues to shape our world in countless ways, from our holidays to our laws to our deepest ethical questions. Understanding his life isn't just about understanding the past. It's about understanding a fundamental piece of our present.